Well, how many of you today would say, I'm a risk taker? Just raise your hand. Okay, there's a few risk takers here. We won't ask you, I could go around and ask you, the different types of risk you take, whether you play the stock market or, whatever it might be. Maybe you're a little risky as you drive, and I'll talk about my own story in that area in a few moments. But our society tends to glorify successful risk takers, like Bill Gates, who dropped out of college to found Microsoft, or Mark Zuckerberg of Facebook, who did the same thing, and even Evan Spiegel, who founded Snapchat. Any of you know what Snapchat is? Yes, there's a few of you on it, I think, and the younger ones especially. He became the youngest billionaire in the world in 2015 at age 25. Yet, not all risk takers are successful. In fact, it's almost the exception that they're successful. If you've ever seen the meme online, "Why Women Live Longer Than Men," you know what I mean. There's some pictures up here. Have any of you seen these pictures going around, maybe through email or whatever? And you wonder, how in the world do people like this survive in daily life? Because if they're dumb enough to do something like this, they must have done something even more stupid elsewhere. I mean, when I look at this forklift thing, it just, gives me the willies, because I used to be a manager at a camp where we had these kinds of equipment, and, the idea of a forklift lifting another forklift is just, beyond the pale. And then, this could almost be our painter's last week, but thankfully, we actually do follow the rules as to how to use ladders and those kinds of things. And then this guy, I don't know where he got the crane. But putting a lawnmower on a crane to trim your hedges is just, I don't know. It just really boggles my mind that he's still alive, but I assume that he is. Not all risks are good risks. And when I was about 17 or 18, I learned this firsthand. I had gotten my driver's license, and I was driving to work and to school as the car was available, and we lived in the country, so the speed limit was always 80. They didn't bother, marking the speed limit down in different places, like when you go around curves. And right near our house, within a kilometer or so, was this S-curve, which you'll see on the screen. I got a satellite photo of it this week. And, I got in the habit, since the speed limit was 80, of seeing how close I could get to 80 going around these turns. I never really got that close. 60 was about as high as I could get. And I kind of thought, every day I'll just try a little bit faster and a little bit faster. And you know where this story is going, right? I guess I kind of expected that maybe I'd feel a bit of a wobble first and think, okay, that's the limit. But, I found out the limit as I was sailing over an embankment down into the ditch and landing in the trees. And you can see the path. I was coming from the top there, and I just basically went straight down. And in fact, I noticed that there's actually a path there now, so obviously other people have followed me and didn't learn the lesson that I learned that day. Pushing the limits, taking risks. There are lots of stupid risks to take. And I do probably need to say here that young people, don't use me as an excuse. Well, Pastor Jay did it, so, God, he saved me from my stupidity, but he doesn't give any guarantees about that. I landed right between two trees. I had trees bending in the doors on either side, so I know that I could have died at that moment. And so I'm not encouraging you to try to discover the limit in that way. But we sometimes think of faith as risk-taking, don't we? Certainly, if you've ever heard any atheists talking, they would talk about how, faith, well, that's just like a leap in the dark. You just kind of believe. And yet, that's not what the Bible shows us. Faith in God is believing in something that we can't see. That's true. But this God has given us evidence to see all around us in what he's created, and also in what he does for us. God has given us his Son, a historical person in history who we can ground the Bible on, who showed that the Bible is true, that there really is a God who cares about us. So he has given us his word, and he backs up that word with his very real presence and even miracles today. I have seen miracles with my own eyes. How many would say today that they have seen, it doesn't have to be something big, but they've seen God act in a way that was outside of the natural? That's a miracle. Look at all these miracles that we're testifying to here among us. God is at work. God is real. And so when we see those things, when we talk about faith, faith isn't this blind risk. It's a risk grounded in who God is, who he's shown him to be. Faith isn't irrational. It's based in God who has shown himself worthy of our trust. And yet, on the other hand, as Pastor Josh shared last week so well from Joshua chapter 1, faith means that we step out of what's comfortable. It does mean that we take some risks. God doesn't usually ask us to take the easy road. I've never found that in my life. I don't know if anyone's here and they're like, yep, God told me, take the easy road. I got an exemption. Anyone here? No. We don't get the easy road, do we? God takes us down paths that challenge us and stretch us and take us out of our comfort zones all the time. And Jesus talked about this in Matthew chapter 7 when he said, wide is the gate and broad is the road that leads to destruction. In other words, the easy road takes you to destruction. Many enter through it, he said. But small is the gate and narrow the road that leads to life, and only a few find it. Because it's the difficult road. And we have to choose, in a sense, to take the difficult road, the road that does involve some risk. Not stupid risks like I took on that S-curve, but risks that God is calling us to make. And so we've been looking at this through our series in Joshua, and our theme is moving forward. And to move forward, you do have to take some risks. You do have to make changes. And so I want us to look at Joshua chapter 2 and consider it in that light today, to look at some people that we find, real people like you and me, who God placed in a situation, and we're going to observe what God did in and through their lives. And so I invite you to turn to Joshua 2. I'm not going to be reading the whole story. It's 24 verses, but I am going to be referring to it, and I want you to be able to look at it and make sure I'm steering you right today. So Joshua 2 opens with Joshua, the leader of Israel, taking a risk. Now, you might not identify it as a risk when you just read the first couple verses and say, well, Joshua appointed a couple of spies to scout out the land, and especially Jericho. But, if you know the whole story, and you look back into Numbers chapter 13, you find out that 40 years ago, Joshua himself was a spy who was sent into Israel to scout out the land. And what happened? 10 spies came back with a bad report. Joshua wasn't one of them. He came back and said, let's go, God will help us. But 10 spies came back with a bad report, and all of Israel rebelled against God that day. And so God sent them back for 40 more years in the wilderness, all because Moses sent spies out into Canaan. And so Joshua could have said, I've been there, I've done that, not doing that again. Couldn't he? And so sending out spies was a risk, a calculated risk. I'm sure that he had a pep talk with them, and he said, now remember what happened last time, guys. I'm not telling you to evaluate whether we can or can't do this. I need information. I need you to scout out the land, investigate, find out all you know so that we're not taking a stupid risk, but we're following what God calls us to do with our eyes wide open. And so Joshua took this necessary risk. Another risk that he took was delegating the responsibility. Joshua had been a good spy. So, he could have said, I'm going in. I'm the leader. I'm going to figure out what we need to do, and you all wait till I come back. But Joshua knew that there are seasons in our life, and there are times when we have to give responsibility away. We can't do it all ourselves. And that's something that we're really attuned with here at PPC. We talk about giving ministry away. That if there's something that you can do, but somebody else can do it just as well or better, or maybe even with a little coaching someday could do it. Just, well, give it away. Let them do it and find what God has for you to do. And so that's what Joshua does. Joshua sends the scouts and trusts them with this responsibility to look over the land, and particularly Jericho. The next risk that we find is on the part of the spies. Because, it wasn't just like if I went down to London, where Tori is from, our intern. I could spy out London and no one would necessarily know I'm from Toronto. But they spoke Hebrew. The Canaanites didn't. They spoke related languages, but it's guaranteed that they had an accent. They probably didn't know some of the words that were in the town, so right away they would be recognized for who they are. So they're going into Jericho, right into the heart of the country. They're not just, out in the hills where they can kind of hide. They're going right into the enemy's territory to discover what the feel is right now and what's happening and how are we going to do this. They were taking a huge risk. And yet, we see in the story that God prepared a way. God knew that that was going to happen, and he prepared a woman named Rahab, a citizen of Jericho, who would protect them in their moment of need. Rahab recognizes these men as Israelites and invites them into her home and offers them protection. Now again, you might not think of this as a huge risk, but if you read the story a little further, you'll find out that it is, because the king is aware that these men are here. But it doesn't take the king being aware. She knew from the start that this was a huge risk, because all of Canaan was on alert. And she talks about this later on in the story, about how everybody has heard about what Israel has already done, how God opened up the Red Sea for them to cross, and how they defeated the kings that were just across the Jordan. And Jericho is just on the west side of the Jordan. So they're probably the closest town to where these kingdoms of Sihon and Og had been destroyed. And so Jericho was on high alert, and Rahab knew this. And so to take them into her house was an act of faith, in sense, an act of saying, God, I trust that somehow by doing this, you're going to save me. Now, I should note at this point that when the king finds out about the spies coming in, that he does ask Rahab about it, and she lies. And sometimes people will point to this passage and say, see, it's okay to lie if you're saving somebody. Situational ethics. You can kind of bend the rules a little bit as long as your heart is good. And yet, the Bible is very clear on this, that Rahab was rewarded for her act of faith in taking in these spies, and not for her lie. And I believe today that just as God provided a way out for the spies through Rahab, that God would have also provided a way out for Rahab if she had, in that moment, said, God, I'm going to trust you. Give me the words. And so she might have been able to say something like, well, you can search the house, but I don't think you'll find anything. And I know that if she had done that God wanted those spies to get back, right? So he would have protected them in some way, whether it's through blinding the people who came in looking so that they just wouldn't see the spies, which we know God has done in other situations. And the Bible is absolutely clear about this, that the end doesn't justify the means. And I'm pausing here for a moment on this because I know that we're in a society of people who believe that the end justifies the means. And there are a lot of you facing this kind of pressure at work all the time, where they want you to get you to bend the rules, or maybe even do something that's technically illegal or whatever it is, in order for the company to get a higher profit or whatever it might be, or for this customer to be happy. And we have to understand that God calls us, we are a people of truth. God is a God of truth. He calls us to stand for what is right. In fact, if we look at what the Bible has to say about this, Paul in Romans chapter 3, verse 7, addresses this exact situation. And he talks about people who would argue, if my lie increases God's glory. So not that it, helps the company or something, but, what if I lie and in some way God gets glory because of it? Maybe I could even claim that, God healed me in some way when he hadn't, or whatever it might be. I'm not sure what the lie was. But he says, if we do this, some people might say, well, why is that a sin? And he said, some slanderously even claim about me, Paul, that we say, let's do evil that good might result. And Paul says, that's because I'm always talking about grace. And so if you just sin more, well, then there'll be more grace. So, God will get more glory. And he says, the people who say this, their condemnation is just. In other words, God is going to judge people who do that kind of thing. Truth is part of God's nature. Even testifying before Pilate when he was at risk of his life and in fact was put to death, Jesus said to Pilate, I have come to testify to the truth, in John chapter 8:37. And so we too, when we're faced with these pressured situations, we need to speak up for what is right and true. But Rahab states her faith, even though she at this point, she's not really even a part of God's community. And so I think we can't judge her with too difficult a standard there. But she states her faith so clearly, beginning in verse 8. And I'm going to read that, where she says, I know that the Lord has given you this land, and that a great fear of you has fallen on us, so that all who live in this country are melting in fear because of you. We have heard how the Lord dried up the water of the Red Sea for you when you came out of Egypt, and what you did to Sihon and Og, the two kings of the Amorites east of the Jordan, whom you completely destroyed. When we heard of it, our hearts melted in fear, and everyone's courage failed because of you. For the Lord your God is God in heaven above and on the earth below. Now, in this one phrase, Rahab is saying an awful lot. Because if you understand that she grew up as an idol worshiper, and the Canaanites believed that different gods had different territories. In fact, if you read ahead in the book of Samuel, you'll find that when Israel was fighting, and actually in the book of Judges as well, when Israel was fighting various nations around them and the Canaanites, that the Canaanites believed in this regional kind of deity where a god would be the god of the valleys, or a god of the hills, or a god of the weather, or a god of this. And so if we can just get the Israelites into a place where their God doesn't have the power, where our God is stronger in this area, well then we'll win. And Rahab says with this that she's rejecting that whole idea. That she doesn't accept the idea that the God of the Israelites is just strong at the moment, or strong in the Red Sea, or strong east of the Jordan. She's saying, God, the Lord, which is Yahweh's name, she's heard of his name, Yahweh, your God, is God in heaven above and on earth below. Everywhere is his domain. And so in this moment, Rahab says, I'm one of you. I believe in the one true God. And this is why the scouts can offer her safety. Because God had said of Jericho that everything had to be destroyed. In fact, in a few chapters later, we're going to see that God took that very seriously, and somebody who just kept a few things is judged because of it. And so the scouts really didn't have the authority to be able to say, we're going to keep you safe. But I believe that they heard from the Spirit of God in that moment and realized she's one of us. She's not a Canaanite that God wants to judge. She is someone who is coming before God Almighty, and she is someone who's going to be a part of us. And so they offered her safety, even as she had offered them safety. And in that moment, Rahab became a part of God's people. She still had to go through a difficult time in the siege of Jericho, and there was probably moments of worry in her heart, and yet she had become a part of the Israelite nation. And if you read in Joshua chapter 6, you'll find that that's exactly what happens, that she is protected and she does become part of Israel. But it even gets better than that. But I have to finish the story before I tell you. So just hold on for that part. So Rahab offers them protection. She lets them out through her window, and she gives them instruction about how they can hide from the search party and be safe until the search party comes back into Jericho. And that happens, and the scouts get back to Israel. And then in the weeks ahead, we'll be looking at all the preparations and what happens in the city of Jericho. But what can we learn from this story today? The first and I think most important part of this story that we can understand is that this is a story of grace. God's amazing grace. Right in the midst of judgment that God is going to bring, we see this amazing story of God's grace that he offers to unlikely people. And I want us to think about this for a moment, because I know that we as Christians, sometimes we are good at offering grace to people we like, and not so good at offering to the grace to the unlovable or the awkward or the difficult or whatever it might be. You know, some people look at the God of the Old Testament and see God as this God of judgment, and the New Testament is the age of grace. And in fact, there's a whole theological system called dispensationalism that looks at it that way. And we don't really subscribe to that. We recognize as what the Bible says, that God is the same yesterday, today, and forever. That just as in the New Testament there is grace and judgment. Judgment is prophesied, it's coming, and we need to get our house in order. We need to make sure that we're doing what God is calling us to do. But there's also this wondrous grace of the cross. In the Old Testament, we also find judgment and grace. And in Joshua chapter 2, we see God's grace so wonderfully displayed. Because if you think about for a moment who Rahab was, a pagan idol worshiper. And yet not just a pagan idol worshiper, but a pagan idol worshiper who was a prostitute by profession. So she broke 2 commandments of the Lord almost every day of her life. Of the major 10 commandments that most of us would think were so important. And not only this, but she's a pagan, idol-worshiping prostitute in a city that God has destined for destruction. And yet God pulled her out of there. God saved the one person whose heart was open. And you know, the wonderful story of God's grace is displayed not just in the fact that Rahab is invited into the community, but in what God does through her life. You see, God uses Rahab to be one of the ancestors of his son, Jesus Christ. If you read Matthew chapter 1, you'll find Rahab, there's only a couple of women mentioned, and Rahab is one of them. She married Salmon, one of the Hebrew people in that day. And she became the great-great-grandmother of King David. What an amazing story of God's grace this is, isn't it? And I know that there's some of us right here in this room who'd feel like, I'm that unlikely person. None of my family are saved. Or maybe you are just the first one who's saved in your family. I've come from a messy background. God's grace is amazing. It's for you. And that's what Paul says as well to the Corinthians. He lists off a whole bunch of sins and says, that's what some of you were. And yet you are washed and cleansed. And that's the story we see here in Joshua chapter 2, that God can use anyone. And in fact, he delights in doing it. If you're here and you're a first-generation Christian, you don't need to feel badly about that. I think those of us who have an inheritance, we should be thankful for the inheritance. And yet those of us who don't should be thankful that God chooses to display his glory so brightly in us, that he called us out of darkness into his glorious light. And so none of us have reason to be ashamed. All of us can be thankful to God for what he has done in our lives. But we need to continue to ask ourselves, are we like the scouts? Are we reaching into places of darkness, calling people out to God's grace? Or are we saying, well, you're just too far gone for God? We'd never say that with words, but with our attitudes. We need to ask God to open our hearts to display his grace in this city, in this place that God has placed us, and see ourselves as scouts who are going out through the land saying, God, I know you've got a plan and a purpose for me, and I'm working out that plan, but where's the Rahab? Where's the person that I'm just going to meet by chance? And it's not by chance. It's a God-ordained moment, like this moment in Jericho. The second thing I think we need to learn from this story today, and I've already talked about it a lot, so I'm going to be short on it, is that following God requires acts of faith. We have to be willing to take the risk. It's not the big risk usually. Oh, it feels big. It feels scary. Sometimes even just choosing to share your faith with someone, maybe in a work environment where not everybody's friendly to that, or a school, it can feel like a big risk. And yet so often when we take the risk, we end up looking back and saying, why was I so afraid? What was the big deal? And it encourages us, and we're so strengthened and encouraged. You know, encouraged just means encouraged. It gives us courage to take the next step that God has for us. And some of us, as Pastor Josh shared last week, have become comfortable. And that's always a temptation, that we become comfortable with where we are, with what God has done in the past, when God may be calling us and saying, you know what, you need to give that away like Joshua gave it away to the scouts, that thing that you've always been doing. I'm calling you into something new. I'm calling you to do something that you're actually going to feel a little bit afraid about, but it's going to stretch you and grow you, and you're going to see me work, and it's going to be an awesome thing. Following God always requires acts of faith. None of us get an exemption from having faith. And God delights in leading us in places where we have to depend on Him, where we don't know exactly what's going to happen. And yet, if we depend on Him, He'll direct us in those moments, and we'll see Him work in amazing ways, just as the scouts did. The third thing that we see from this story is that God does prepare the way for us. I mean, what the scouts were asked to do, to go into Jericho and not get caught, I mean, when I look at it, I don't know how they expected that to happen and to work. It's an amazing thing, and yet they went with that sense that God is going to help us because He's promised this land to us. And we too, as we take those risks that God is calling to us, we need to do so with this understanding that God is preparing the way. He's promised to prepare the way. It doesn't mean that nothing difficult will ever happen to us. But if God is preparing the way, then we don't need to fear. No matter what happens, He's going to give us the strength for each and every moment. Are you trusting that God is preparing the way? Or are you comfortable? Are you holding back because you're not quite sure and you have to work out all the details? They tried. They did whatever they could to work out the details. That's why Joshua is sending them. And yet, they had to take the risk and know that the things that are unknowable, well, God knows those. And so I'm going to trust that He's going to prepare the way, and it's going to be okay. The fourth and last thing, there's so many other things I could talk about from this story today, but the fourth thing that God laid on my heart today is that God's plan involves real community. Rahab, I mean, if you were reaching Rahab in that city, there's a lot of things you could have done differently than the scouts, couldn't you? You could have said, well, here's the 4 spiritual laws. We're all separated from God by sin, and you know, well, Jesus wasn't there yet, so you'd have a little trouble with that one. But, you know, God's going to bridge the way, and let's pray and you can pray the sinner's prayer, and then you go on your way, and whatever happens, happens. Hope God protects you. And yet, that's not what they did. They invited her into their community. And as I already mentioned, we see her brought into that community, becoming part of Jesus' ancestry. And you know, today in our culture, we're very familiar with this God and me kind of relationship. And you can come to a church every day or every Sunday. But yes, even every day. We're open every day. So you could actually come here every day. And yet, never be a part of a community. You could come and feel like the most spiritual person ever. You could spend all this time in prayer meetings and it's just you and God and you feel so wonderful, and yet never actually do what God's called us to do. Because God didn't call us to a one-on-one relationship with Him and that's all. God called us into a community. He calls us His body, the church. And He intends for us not just to attend church on Sunday and shake hands at greeting time, but to actually get to know one another. And we can't get to know everyone here, but all of us need to know someone else. Because that's how we encourage one another. That's how we keep going. That's how we persevere. There's so many times in my life where I would have dropped out if it was just me. And yet God brought along people beside me. And I can think of so many people in my life who've just brought that word of encouragement or the example of their life that I have known them well enough to say, God, if you could get them through this moment, that moment that they were through, God, you're going to help me through this moment. And that only happens as we have relationship and hear one another's stories. And so today, this is the point that we're really going to call upon you for action. All those other points, I believe the Holy Spirit is at work in our hearts. And some of us really need those other points. And if so, then I hope you're listening to the Spirit of God and saying, yes, Lord, I'm going to offer grace. I'm going to step out in faith. I'm going to get out of my comfort zone. But for some of us, actually, seeking to experience community, that is the risk today. That is the step of faith. And that's where we want to challenge you today. That's why we've called today Connect Sunday. Because we want to help you to connect, either through serving, through picking up, in a sense, a new calling, a new ministry that you're going to say, God, I'm going to do my best for you in this area and alongside other people and get to know one another and strengthen one another as we work for your kingdom together. Or in joining the community and saying, I want to become part of a small group. I really need that encouragement and accountability that comes as I'm part of a group that is studying your word or whatever the topic might be and helping one another to go forward. And I know that this idea of accountability, it can be a scary thing for some. Some of you have been burned in the past and it's been difficult and hard. And I just want to remind us about the people in our story today. They're broken, messy people just like all the rest of us. There's no perfect people. We're not a perfect church. And any group that you've been part of was full of imperfect people who hopefully were all struggling to become more like Christ, just like you are. And so if you got burned last time, then just like Joshua, who got burned when the other spies brought back a bad report, can you today say, you know what? God, I understand that your word says that I'm not just an individual, I'm part of a body. And so I'm going to risk again. Just like Joshua did, I'm going to try it again and again and again until you help me to find the community where I fit. Because all of us have gifts. Paul talks about this in 1 Corinthians and talks about how we all have a part to play and we're all needed. We need you. You need us. And so if you don't feel like PPC is really a family for you today, that you just come and you're all alone, maybe you casually know a few people, but you're not really in relationship, then this morning is for you.